Okay, welcome to the BBVA Foundation Lecture Talks on Demography Today, sponsored by the BBVA Foundation and co-organized with the European Society of Historical Demography and the ECO-ERC Advanced Project. And we have the great pleasure to have today here Sanyu Mojola. He's a professor of sociology and public affairs, the Maurice Durin Professor of Demographic Studies, and the director of the Office of Population Research at Princeton University. She is also an honorary professor at the Medical Research Council, with Rural Public Health and Health Transition Research Unit, a Faculty of Health Sciences, and a School of Public Health, University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago and was previously on the faculty at the University of Michigan and the University of Colorado Boulder. She has served on the editorial boards of the American Journal of Sociology, the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, and Studies in Family Planning. And she's serving on the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Wellbeing, and is forthcoming editorial board member of the Population and Development Review. She has been working extensively on HIV in Africa, and today we will have the pleasure to hear her talk on HIV after 40 in rural South Africa. As usual, we have 30 to 45 minutes just for the presentation. And again, thank you very much for coming to Madrid just to give this talk.
So thank you so much for being here in person and online. I'm really grateful to the Spanish National Research Council, European Society of Historical Demography, and the BVA Foundation, and especially Professor Diego Ramiro Fariñas for the invitation and the opportunity to share my work with you all today. So I'll be presenting work from a large team project called HIV After 40 in Rural South Africa, Aging in the Context of an HIV Epidemic. And my goal is to pull together findings from across published and ongoing work to tell a larger story of the complexities of aging in post-apartheid South Africa. As the COVID-19 pandemic has shown, disease has a way of shedding light on social inequality and population dynamics. And so this is what we're going to try and do here. In most of my projects, I'm interested in the story that numbers about health tell us about how a society is organized. So I tend to start with a demographic trend, and then I use qualitative data to unpack the social processes and mechanisms producing those trends, sometimes going back and forth between survey and qualitative data to unpack the story. And so that's the approach we take here. So the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Africa is now in its 4th decade. And as anti-retroviral therapy, or ART, which prolongs the lives of people living with HIV, begins to be scaled up across the continent, there's a growing call for research on HIV among older adults, especially as increasing numbers of middle-aged adults are aging with HIV, and increasing numbers of older adults are acquiring or at risk of acquiring HIV at older ages. South Africa is a particularly critical site to understand HIV/AIDS in older ages for several reasons. First, its HIV epidemic is the most severe in the world. Almost 8 million South Africans are now living with HIV and AIDS. So this is about 20% of the population. So just imagine 1 in 5 South Africans over the age of 15 living with HIV. And it's also the world's largest such population. And second, South Africa has a rapidly aging population with the highest proportion of older people in Africa. So about 15% of South Africans, that number is probably higher now, are now aged 50 and over. And finally, in 2009, South Africa greatly expanded ART availability, improving survival rates of people living with HIV. And so Hontelez and colleagues estimate a 50% increase in the HIV prevalence among older adults in the next 15 years. And so in combination, these significant demographic shifts suggest that South Africa will soon be coping with the largest number of adults transitioning to older ages with HIV. So the overall goal of HIV After 40, which focuses on adults aged 40 to 90 plus, is to document and understand HIV risk and protective practices among middle-aged and older adults. So this is a largely neglected population in HIV research, but also to examine the role of the life course and larger social contexts in shaping HIV vulnerability as people age. So I work with a large research team of co-investigators, consultants, and graduate students, some of whom have graduated, and so I'm listing them here. So Brian Ahul, Jane Mencken, Nicole Angotti, Xavier Gomez Olivet is from Spain. Works in South Africa. Chodziwadziwa Kabudula, Enid Schatz, Fuzimuzi Dlamini. And then current and former graduate students, so Erin Ice, Shao Tsuyu, Yunhan Wen, Miriam Counterman, Laurie Hawkins, David Ifeolu, Jeanette Norrington, Kai Wasson, Alison O'Rourke, and Neely Wester. So you can imagine the challenges of scheduling a team phone call. We have a 7 a.m. in Colorado, US, 11 p.m. in Canberra, Australia. So it's a challenge. So the study is based in the Agincourt Health and Socio-Demographic Surveillance System, AHDSS, and this is run by the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. It's an annual household census that was established in 1992 prior to significant socio-political change and the emergence of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the country. It captures dynamic social health and epidemiological transitions in rural South Africa. And at the time of our study, it covered 90,000 people living in 16,000 households in a sub-district of 27 villages in Mpumalanga province, northeast South Africa. It's directed by Professor Stephen Tolman and Kathy Khan. Xavier Gomez Olivet runs the site along with Chodziwadziwa Kabudula. So as a former apartheid homeland, while much has changed, it remains burdened with a long legacy of policies of differential development which created poor communities and weak health services. It's a low rainfall setting with limited subsistence farming and employment options. So let me talk a bit about the data. We drew in an innovative mixed methods data set with 5 data sources nested within the AHDSS, collected by various team members. So in addition to the longitudinal household survey, which is run by Professor Xavier Gomez Olivet, the team members led by Jane Mencken, Nicole Angotti, and others conducted a nested population-based HIV NCD prevalence and risk behavior survey 2010 to 2011, 5,000 respondents who were nested within the household survey. And then of those, about 2,000 were aged 40 and over. We then conducted 2 waves of nested qualitative life history interviews. So we basically interviewed people who had participated in the survey and were also part of the census. So we have a lot of longitudinal information, from 2010, and then we followed up with 60 interviews in 2013, and then 5 years later in 2018 of people who were in the survey. We also conducted 2 sets of focus group interviews, and so these are just interviews within the community. So in 2013, we did 9 focus group interviews with 77 people, and then in 2018, we did 12 focus groups with 84 people in the community. And then finally, we conducted 9 key informant interviews. These were interviews with health workers, so people who process a lot of people, nurses and other health workers in hospitals and clinics. And we plan to do a final data collection effort, but had to cancel those because of the pandemic. So we weren't able to do a further follow-up of the key informant interviews. And so let me start by describing the HIV epidemic in Agincourt. And so the figure depicted here illustrates the high HIV prevalence rates in our study context, Agincourt. I'll just let you sort of take it in. And as you can see, HIV prevalence rates are especially high among older adults. And so this is the HIV prevalence here, and then these are the age groups along the x-axis. And so as you can see, by the early 20s, about a quarter a quarter of young women and almost 10% of men are positive. By the mid to late 30s, almost half of young adults are living with HIV. But what is less well documented and especially striking is that HIV rates continue to be high among middle-aged and older adults. So this goes up to age 85, right? And you also now, so about a third of people in their 50s, right? You can see 35% roughly among men in their 50s, about 30%, almost 28% of women in their 50s, 5 to 10% of people in their 70s are living with HIV. And so notice too that HIV rates don't monotonically decline. They seem to rise and fall over the life course. And so I'm going to return to this point later. So the striking prevalence rates highlighted in the figure suggest that in this setting, more than a third of adults could be aging with HIV in the coming decades this side of a cure. So further, the recency of widespread anti-retroviral rollout in the site, it was first publicly available in 3 area hospitals in 2004 and in local clinics in 2008, and then this survey was conducted 2010 to 2011. So you can only live about 6 to 10 years without medication. So this suggests we're not just looking at survivors, but also new infections among older adults. And certainly it seems to suggest that for people aged 50 and over, they most likely acquired HIV after the age of 40. So in trying to answer the question, why are HIV rates so high among middle-aged and older adults in this setting, we've devoted a set of papers to examining HIV risk and protective practices such as condom use, concurrent or overlapping partners, HIV testing, and so on. But we're also spending a lot of time thinking more broadly about a life course approach to HIV vulnerability. That is, how do HIV risk and protective factors vary across the life course? And in particular, how are they shaped by processes of biophysiological aging, demographic, socio-historical, and structural change, and local semiotic or meanings, understandings that shape whether people take up HIV protective practices and social contexts relevant to different stages of the life course. And so I'm going to discuss a few of these findings next. So let me begin by characterizing sexual risk and protective factors in our study population. And so these are findings from the HIV survey and work led by Brian Hall. And I want to note at the outset that the standard limitations of survey data on sexual behavior. So in particular, underreporting by women and overreporting by men, right? So this is like the sort of secretive females, right? Women always lie. They say they've had less partners than they've had. Men exaggerate. They always say that they've had more partners than they have because of social desirability bias. But then also recall bias because we're interviewing older adults, and so they're retrospectively describing their lives. So we want to keep those things in mind. And so as you can see, there are a number of factors here putting middle-aged and older adults at risk of acquiring HIV. And so first, starting with circumcision, you'll notice it's fairly low in this population. So more than 70% of men over the age of 40 are not circumcised. And this means that they're more likely to acquire HIV if they're exposed. There are also striking gender differences in recency of sex. So as you'll see, 30% of women report no sex in the last 2 years after the age of 40. And by age 60, almost 80% of women tell us that they haven't had sex in the last 2 years. Almost no women report extramarital partners, but about 20% of men in their 40s and 50s and 10% in their 60s say that they've had an extramarital partner. There are few gender differences in condom use, and overall it's very low among those in their 40s and 50s, and almost non-existent. So almost no people over the age of 60 said that they had used condoms. Okay. And so in attempting to make sense of these findings, we developed a theoretical framework to guide our analysis of the role of social contexts in helping us explain HIV vulnerability as it shifts across the life course. And so we think about the role of people's work and the local and national economy, their finances and the role of government grants such as pensions, their general health, as well as hospitals and clinics, and then finally their partner, right? Because HIV is sexually transmitted. So we want to think about their partner and their household, and then also their extended family and local community. And so this perspective then situates disease outcomes and factors that create vulnerability or protection in the context of people's lives as a whole. And so we also think about the role of these social contexts as they vary across the life course. So to further investigate this, we drew on survey data and our life history and focus group interviews. So a key reason that respondents gave in interviews for having multiple partnerships was migration. So in Agincourt, approximately 60% of men and 20% of women aged 20 to 60 are regular circular labor migrants, so they travel constantly for work. And we noticed an interesting life course pattern in the impact of migration on HIV risk. So infidelity in marriage was particularly acute when couples were in their 40s and early 50s. Among men who were still migrating back and forth for work on the farms, the game reserves, the mines, and the cities. In life history interviews with those in their mid-50s to their 70s, many married women with formerly migrant husbands discussed frankly their suspicions or knowledge that their partners had many girlfriends in their place of work. And while sex might be intermittent during the migratory stage of a couple's relationship, couples would be more repeatedly exposed when they transitioned out of migration and reunited. So for example, in an interview with Thomas, that's a pseudonym, who was 51 years old, living with HIV, he described his concurrent partnerships when he was younger with one regular partner and several casual partners. So at Qualitative, I met a lot of girls, but I only had one full-time partner. She was from Makoko. The other ones were just casual partners, and I met them during school holidays because at work they were calling them for part-time jobs during school holidays. That's when I met a lot of them. So I only had one full-time partner. I only came home with her one time. Now, while it was primarily men and their partners who reported men's extramarital partnerships in the survey and interviews, there were also a few instances where respondents reported that while the husbands were away, wives also had extramarital partnerships. So we're working on a couple of papers looking at these sorts of reporting biases, finding evidence that indeed women are underreporting their extramarital partners. So transactional relationships, these are non-marital, non-commercial relationships in which money was exchanged, but in which love and trust were also considered at stake, were common in this setting. Men were expected to provide in relationships and therefore needed money. A new influx of money came into communities when men retired in their 50s with disability or work-related pensions, and when they became eligible for government pensions in their 60s. So some men used this money to facilitate their relationships with younger women in the highest risk age groups. And so men were aware of the risk of younger female partners, as these focus group excerpts from men in their 60s suggest. So one man said, if I can respect myself and my wife by not going out to sleep with young women, stay home and use my pension money with my wife. Another participant said, he's telling the truth. If you take care of yourself, not sleeping with young women, you won't get infected by HIV because young women are the ones with HIV. And so we looked in the survey for supporting evidence of this, and we found that men living with HIV did seem to have significantly younger partners than those without HIV. And so we found that for men in their 60s, those who were negative had partners 8 years younger, and those who were positive had partners who were 11 years younger. And there were even larger gaps for men in their 70s. Those who were HIV negative had partners 12 years younger, and those who were positive had partners who were 16 years younger. And so another important and more proximate context to consider is the relationship context and gendered sexuality as people aged. And so the clear picture emerging from women's and men's interviews was that women lost interest in sex while men continued to want sex but at lower frequencies. And so this created important gender asynchronies that had consequences for HIV risk as well as protection. So in some partnerships, men had affairs and women accepted it because they didn't want sex. And if you recall, there was a large gender gap in recent sex in the survey. And so this was one avenue through which HIV entered the marriage. So in a typical response, in women's life history interviews, when we asked, has the way you feel about sex changed in any way as you've gotten older? Jane, again a pseudonym, said it has changed because my blood is no longer flowing like when I was young. The blood that was making a person to want a man has stopped. So how are you going to want a man? And so women's focus group interviews also discussed the consequences of the loss of interest in sex in men's affairs with same-age and younger partners. So for example, in this quote from a 50s women's focus group, one woman said, they'll take your husband. And the other one said, let them take him, I'm tired. I don't want to have sex anymore. And another said, young girls will take him away from you. And so they also discussed the consequences of this for their own risk. One woman said, because if you're the wife and you're tired, you don't want to have sex, then he's going to go out and find someone else, and then will bring HIV back. I'm sick with the disease inside. And many women also felt powerless in their ability to avoid HIV. So for example, one woman said, when he comes home, I refuse to have sex with him, but he's my husband. How many days will you refuse? And so she felt that abstinence was only a short-term strategy to try and avoid HIV. Another woman said, sometimes he says, I don't want condoms. And sometimes he pretends as if he forgot to put on a condom. Sometimes I don't have sex with him and abstain because I have that thought that when we abstain, I'm trying to avoid it. And so this case was interesting because in the survey, she had tested positive for HIV. But in the interview, she didn't disclose that she had HIV. And so she may not have been aware, in fact, that she was positive. The interviewers were not. We didn't tell the interviewers ahead of time people's HIV status. They would only know if the person in the interview revealed. So you can sort of see the discrepancy. She's trying to avoid, but obviously has not succeeded. So many women also felt that testing was a challenge to demand. So in a mixed gender focus group among respondents in their 40s, the following unfolded. Men don't want to go for the test. They're the ones who have girlfriends. He infects you. If you tell him that you don't understand the life he's living and ask him to go for an HIV test, he would say, okay, if you want me to go there, I better go back to where I'm from. And so overall, our findings suggest the importance of having a life course approach to understanding HIV vulnerability, one that takes account of gender, life course stage, and social context. And it also adds dynamism to how we think about HIV risk and protective factors as they unfold in people's lives. And so this figure summarizes our findings within this framework. And so relatively high risk for men in their 40s because of concurrent relationships at work, lower risk for women because of their absent spouses. But then during reunions or when men start to come back from labor migration, then you have elevated risk for women, especially as they age into their 50s. And then at older ages, as we saw in the surveys, women report no sex in the last 2 years, and they describe being tired of sex, and this kept their risk low. But then their husbands are now eligible for pensions in their 60s, and they have relationships with younger women, right? So the pension money is, to take them out for dinner, to treat them nicely. And so then they get HIV. The wives are like, let them take him, I'm tired. But they also say they couldn't refuse the husband sex for long. And so men have relationships with women in the highest risk prevalence, which then puts older women at risk for HIV, right? And so this then makes sense of this rise and fall in HIV prevalence as people age. And so final part of the social context, let me move to the last paper, is looking at the larger health landscape within which the South African HIV epidemic is unfolding. So I want to look at this last piece here of general health. And in this paper, we ask, what is the meaning of health in a setting with so much illness and mortality? I've just shown you very high HIV rates. And I'll show you that it's not just HIV, that's a big disease in this area. The African continent is undergoing a complex epidemiological transition. And so even before the global COVID-19 pandemic, African populations have had a high ongoing burden of infectious diseases at young and middle ages, alongside a growing burden of chronic diseases at middle and older ages. And this is creating a unique socio-epidemiological context across the continent, in which the individual and communal burden and experience of poor health are now extending across greater proportions of the life course. And this is likely to affect how people, and especially older adults in such settings, assess their health. And so we've drawn a unique mixed methods data set that includes a population-based survey that I described with disease biomarkers, self-assessments of health in the survey, and then nested qualitative life history interviews with survey participants, which include questions about the lived experiences of health to examine how middle-aged and older adults make sense of their health. And so let me first talk a bit about how we measure health. So the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And illness and health are examined in a range of ways. So the most common, these objective biomarker measures, so blood tests or glucometers that establish the presence of disease in an individual or the prevalence of disease in a population. Scholars also use qualitative studies that examine the lived experiences of health and illness. But perhaps the most widely used measures of self-assessed health is the self-rated health measure that asks, in general, would you say your health is very good, good, fair, or poor? It's an appealing survey measure for a number of reasons. First, it closely approximates the WHO's holistic definition by enabling respondents to connect subjective and objective health together, including assessments of physical health and functioning, health risk behaviors, social roles and relationships, psychosocial well-being in their self-ratings of health. But second, and this is really striking, this single measure appears to be more reliable than biometric health measures or even physician assessments, right? So this is the strange thing. This question seems to be much more reliable in predicting mortality, future mortality, than anything other measures. And third, its relationship to health outcomes seems to be robust to variations in survey question phrasings. So questions asking about health in general, health at the present time, today, health compared to others the same age, and item choice differences. And so some only have 3 options, some have 7 options, and the outcome seems to be robust. And then finally, as I mentioned, its predictive relationship to mortality and its utility as a health measure has been established across different ethnic groups and also multiple countries, including African countries. And so while each method of assessment provides important information about health and illness, in this study we build on work by Hila and Idler and colleagues, call for more studies examining relationships between biophysiological and self-assessed health, and more research on the various factors that people draw on when asked to assess their health. And so we advance the literature by combining and triangulating among biometric, survey, and qualitative measures of illness from the same individuals to examine the meaning of health. And so this both enables identification of discrepancies among measures of health, so when people are very ill but say their health is good, and then why those differences exist. And so to guide our analysis, we focus on 3 factors: gender, the life course, and the socio-epidemiological context. So the experience of illness is gendered and varies across the life course. And so in almost every country, including South Africa, while men have a higher mortality rate, women report worse self-rated health. And this is mirrored in more reports of illness, life-threatening conditions, and functional ability limitations. In addition, our research suggests that gender differences in health vary across the life course. So in the US, at younger ages, women report worse self-rated health than men, but the gap narrows at older ages and disappears after the age of 75. And this is work by Zyakova and colleagues. But while there are underlying biological drivers of sex and aging that lead to illness, this process is exacerbated by the social construction as captured by gender and life course stage. And so a social constructivist approach then situates health and well-being within the larger context of people's lives. So gender is pervasive. It organizes identities, self-concepts and beliefs, interactions with others, and the way individuals experience or are treated by institutions such as the workplace, household, and healthcare systems. And this also varies across the life course. So in theorizing the concept of the gendered life course, Moen said gender differences in health and psychosocial well-being in later adulthood reflect both women's and men's differential roles, relationships, and resources, and the gendered context in which they're experienced. And so a study extends the literature by triangulating among multiple assessments of health to identify the differential role of gender and the life course in shaping the meaning of health among men and women at different points of the life course. So the final piece here is the socio-epidemiological context. An understudied but arguably major driver of variation in health assessments across countries and settings is what we're calling the socio-epidemiological context. And we define this as characterized by interactions between the overall disease burden in a population, the distribution of disease across the population, real and perceived disease etiologies or causes, as well as the social meanings attached to various diseases. And so a high disease burden concentrated at older ages is a feature of many high-income countries and is a function of increased life expectancies, right? So there's high burdens of illness at older ages in Europe and the US. But in many African countries, a high disease burden has been arrived at in much more complex ways, creating a really unique socio-epidemiological context. So you have high rates of ongoing childhood illnesses, and then among young and middle-aged adults, you have the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which introduced dramatic increases in morbidity and mortality. But then you also have anti-retroviral therapy, which meant that people didn't die, but they just now had a long-term chronic illness. And then more Africans are surviving to older ages and acquiring non-communicable chronic diseases characteristic of aging. And so the result then is that morbidity is stretched across the life course. And this means that compared to high-income countries, different or shifting reference points for what constitutes good health may arise at earlier points in the life course. So as growing proportions of Africans spend increasing amounts of time managing illness or taking care of somebody who is ill, we might expect more variation in the relationship between an objective health outcome and how people assess their health. So let me turn to the data. We use objective health measures. So we tested people for HIV antibodies. We also tested people's blood pressure. So these were 3 measures, and we used an average of the last 2. We tested people's blood sugar, what we're calling probable diabetes. And then we also, in the survey, we asked people to rate their health. So how would you rate your health today? Very bad, bad, good, very, very good. We also asked about their functional ability as another measure. So overall, in the last 30 days, how much difficulty did you have with work or household activities, none, mild, severe, or extreme? We also asked about their medication use in the past 2 weeks. So diabetes medicine, blood pressure medicine, as well as anti-retroviral therapy, and then a range of socio-demographic variables. In the life history interviews, these were nested. So again, interviews of people who took these questions, and then we also tested. We asked, how is your health these days? Any current health concerns or issues in the last year? If so, where do you seek treatment? Is there anything that keeps you from seeking treatment when you're sick? Who from your family takes care of you when you're sick? Are you on any Western or alternative medication? Is taking medication a problem? And finally, as you get older, what do you think your major health concerns will be? So in terms of methods, we conducted mixed methods analyses for this paper. In the first stage, we conducted quantitative analyses, We looked at trends in objective health markers, so HIV, hypertension, and diabetes. Subjective health, we focused on self-rated health, but also did additional analyses on functional ability and medication use, how they vary by age group and gender. And then we also did ordinal logistic regression to examine factors associated with self-rated health. In the second stage, we did deductive and inductive coding of qualitative interviews. And as part of this, we also ascribed survey characteristics to each interview. So for each person, we looked at their outcomes in the survey and then added them to the interview. And then we examined the relationships of those objective markers to how people were describing their lives. And then in the final stage, we triangulated. We combined the findings from these two stages, and then we conducted supplemental quantitative and qualitative analyses to investigate the discrepancies. So happy to talk more in the Q&A about the methods. So let me turn to the findings. They're somewhat surprising. And so first, most people in our study setting, 73% people aged 40 and over were living with at least one major health condition. Right? So 60% were living with hypertension, 22% were living with HIV, 4% were living with diabetes. And what you'll notice here is that there was no significant trend by age group in the proportions having any disease, right? So this is, you would expect more older ages and higher morbidity, but what we found was actually no significant differences across age group. What we did find that was different was the type of morbidity that varied. So those aged 60 and over were more likely to have hypertension. Those in their 50s, those below age 70 were more likely to have HIV, and they were more likely to have multiple diseases, right? And so the first question is, well, what's the meaning of health when, well, almost everybody is sick, and when there's no variation in age? And so we disaggregated this by gender, and then the story remains largely the same, except for those aged 70 and over, where we see significant differences among older women who are more likely to have a disease, and then also more likely to have hypertension, and then also among men in their 50s who are more likely to have HIV. Okay, and so generally speaking, we didn't see major gender differences. And so when we look at trends in self-rated health, again, the puzzle is most people said their health was either very good, these are the dark blue bars, or good, the medium blue bars. So 51% said their health was very good, 30% said their health was good, and 18% rated their health as bad, and 1% as very bad. So respondents reported worse health in each subsequent older age group. So you'll notice, as in the table before, no difference in objective markers, but we do see difference in how they assess their health in the survey. And so about 12% in their 40s, 20% in their 70s reported bad or very bad health. And so this suggested that the largest discrepancy between biometric measures and self-rated health was among those in their 40s, where 70% were living with a major chronic disease, and 88% said their health was good or very good. So when you look at gender differences, and these are these two panels here, men report better health than women, as we expect. But when we look across the life course, there appears to be apparent divergence in reporting in the 40s and the 70s, but apparent convergence or similarity in ratings among people in the 50s and 60s. And so I'm going to come back to that finding in the qualitative and triangulated findings. And so when we run ordinal logistic regressions, we found that self-rated health was not associated with objective health outcomes. And this was also surprising. And this held after accounting for age group, gender, socioeconomic, and union status. So as you can see, HIV, hypertension, diabetes all overlap with 0. And we did a range of robustness checks, and this finding held. And so overall, the descriptive and regression analyses present two puzzles. First, why is there no significant relationship between having a major chronic condition and self-assessed health? And second, what might explain then the gendered and age-based variation in self-rated health that persists after adjusting for biometric measurements of health status? Overall, our qualitative and triangulated analyses and findings suggest that against a backdrop of socio-epidemiological context characterized by widespread morbidity where most people are ill, gender and life course stage work together to increase or reduce the salience of chronic illness in our health self-assessments. And so let me turn to some of the qualitative and triangulated findings. Analysis suggests that people in their 40s assess their health through the lens of gendered family expectations relating to household care for women and breadwinning for men. And these expectations seem to reduce or increase the salience of chronic disease depending on whether they had the functional ability to take care of their family. And so for women, when we asked them it didn't seem as if having a major chronic condition was associated with the assessment of health in interviews. But the relevance of family concerns became evident when we asked about future health concerns. And so Rita, living with HIV and on ART, said, "I never thought about what's going to happen to my health. I'm still caring for my children. They're still young. I still want them to grow up. Only God knows what's going to happen to me." And so when we did triangulation analyses, we found that functional ability was associated with self-rated health. It wasn't associated with biometric or objective health markers, but it was associated with how people rate their health. And so if women weren't able to do housework, then their health was bad. But if they were able to do housework, it didn't matter what kind of disease they had. Their health was good. But for men, when we asked them about health, they responded with employment issues. So for example, do you have current health concerns? Samson said, "My problem is money. It's what makes me worried." And this was true in other interviews. Lazarus, "How's your health these days?" "It's good. There's no problem. It's only a job problem." So the interviewer sort of pushes, "No, I really mean health. Current health concerns or issues? No, I'm just looking for a job." And so we were puzzled by this sort of, why are men saying jobs when we're asking about health? And so we did triangulation analyses. And we ran an interaction term with men and employment and found that it was significant and completely accounted for the gender difference in self-rated health. So in other words, being a man was no longer significantly associated with reporting better health, but being an employed man was significantly associated with better health. And so for men, health was about, can I provide for my family, right? Not about objective health measures. So people in their 50s and 60s, there was, again, no significant increase in objective health differences between people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. But in self-rated health, they reported worse health compared to those in their 40s. So in the trends and interviews, we also found a similarity in how men and women reported their health. So Hezekiah said, "My health doesn't have a station. I have diabetes and high blood pressure. These are troubling a lot." So now men were talking about health issues. Women, Sifiwe was talking about her friends. "One is not feeling well. I push her with a wheelbarrow to go to the toilet. Yesterday I was helping her. Now if she calls, she says she didn't sleep well. I'll cook my food and give her. I'll bring her warm water." So she says her friends are negative. Her herself, she was living with HIV. Their problems are sugar diabetes and high blood pressure. The interviewer said each has her own illness. And so respondents in the 50s and 60s were in a different life stage than those in the 40s. They had grown children who could help them in housework and with money. They were starting to get pensions from the government. So men in particular no longer had to worry about money. And so we looked at that interaction again. It was no longer significant, the work and gender interaction for men after the age of 50, only for men in the 40s. So it seems as if a changing life stage was what made illness much more salient for men and women. And so finally, for people aged 70 and over, we saw significant gender differences among adults aged 70 and over, and more women reported being ill compared to men. And part of this is mortality selection. It was a really big mortality shock. More men died earlier due to the AIDS epidemic. And this was reflected in divergent gendered lived experiences of health. And the big concern was whether you had a caregiver. So 78% of men had living wives, and 30% of women had living husbands. And so in triangulation analyses, we found that being in a union was significantly associated with self-rated health only for people aged 70 and over. But it wasn't significant for younger, people. And so in interviews, we saw this show up as well. So Jonzani didn't have an illness, but said, I can only have problems if my wife is not there. When I was ill, she took care of me. I couldn't walk. I don't want to be too, and she was able to carry me on the wheelbarrow to the clinic and even to the hospital. And I thank her for all that. But by contrast, Mary, 71, twice widowed, no children, was on ART, high blood pressure medication. She said, I don't want to be a burden. People get tired of me. I won't have anyone to take care of me. And so in sum, it seemed as if men and women in their 70s were differentially buffered from the challenges of aging with illness, increasing or decreasing the salience of poor health. So just a few comments on this paper, and then I'll conclude. So we tried to examine the meaning of health in a population where most people are ill and living with a major chronic condition, and yet 81% said they had good or very good health. We drew on a unique mixed method study with biometric measures, survey-reported measures, and nested qualitative life history interviews to examine this puzzle. And we found that self-rated health was not associated with biometric measures. And we think that part of this is because if most people are ill, the reference group may be those who are dead or fully disabled. And so it would change the assessment of what counts as good health. Agincourt lived through a very severe HIV and AIDS epidemic, and a significant mortality shock and a rising burden of non-communicable disease. And these have combined to increase the population living with chronic illness. We also find that the socio-epidemiological context intertwined with the gendered life course to regulate assessments of health, increasing or reducing the salience of physical ailments. Our site is likely at the leading edge of not just South Africa, but global trends, as growing morbidity resulting from longer life expectancies normalizes the experience of aging with chronic illness. In addition, the continued resurgence of infectious diseases such as COVID-19, as well as a growing burden of chronic disease in an aging population, suggests that the socio-epidemiological context may play a big role in shaping health assessments in other settings. And so for future research, we suggest that the role of the burden of disease in a population may have an impact on the relationship between biometric and self-ratings of health. And overall, I think our study illustrates the rich potential of mixed methods research in elucidating the meaning of health as people age. So let me offer some final concluding thoughts and then move to Q&A. So our project so far makes some empirical, theoretical, methodological contributions to the fields of aging, the life course, gender, and sociology of health and illness. And so our study provides significant new information about the African HIV epidemic among middle-aged and older adults, and especially sexual behavior and HIV risk and protective practices. There are few African surveys that examine adults past reproductive ages, because many surveys were designed to look at fertility. And we also make theoretical and methodological contributions. And so we try and theoretically think about a life course approach to thinking about HIV vulnerability, and also illustrate the value of mixed methods data sets in high disease burdens. And finally, we also hope our research contributes to policy, in particular crafting more nuanced HIV prevention campaigns that attend to life course stages and transitions. But a first step would simply be recognizing that older adults are sexually active and also vulnerable to HIV. So I just want to thank the following funding agencies: the National Institute on Aging, the Wellcome Trust, the University of Colorado Boulder, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and the Spark Fellowship. I also want to thank the folks who helped to administer all of this, who are often not recognized. So Robin, Nancy, Maureen, and Maria. So thanks so much for your time, attention. I look forward to comments and questions.